So in this next section, we're going to expand on our nutrient groups discussed in the last section, section 10.1a, and discuss carbohydrates. We're going to go on to talk about proteins and lipids in the next little section, but the carbohydrate section in this course is the most detailed. So don't forget to open up our Zoom meeting if you have any questions and ask me to clarify. I'll be happy to do that. So first of all, I want you to just take a minute and think about, well, carbohydrates, carbs, what is it that they, what function do they serve in an animal's system? For instance, the human body. Well, I'm hoping what you can think about, aside from maybe what you may consider to be the obvious, which is that it's the primary energy source for cells. Our cells will grab onto carbohydrate molecules first before they will grab onto lipid or protein molecules in order to break them down for food. So if you're feeling a little lightheaded or a little bit of, you're having a little bit of, you need an energy boost, grab some carbohydrates because your body will metabolize those first. So let's take a little look here at this diagram here, and I want to remind you about what we're looking at. So carbohydrates is a fancy word for sugar, and we're going to explore in this section a bunch of different types of sugar. I'm hoping you can see from this diagram that what I've got here is a depiction of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So most of you will recognize O2 and CO2 and H2O, but what you may not recognize is this big molecule here, C6H12O6. Well, that is a molecule, that is the molecular formula for glucose. So glucose is in fact the primary energy source for cells. It's what our cells will use before all else. And we've evolved to use it fairly efficiently through a process called cellular respiration. So what I've got here is the mitochondrion. And in grade, I want to say 7 or 8, when you first start to learn about the cell, you learn that the role of the mitochondria is to be the powerhouse of the cell. And that is because glucose that we absorb through our digestive system moves via our circulatory system to the mitochondria in our cell, where our mitochondrion takes it along with oxygen and turns it into energy in the form of this special molecule called ATP, which, by the way, ATP will be discussed in great detail in grade 12. You just need to know that our glucose produces energy in the mitochondrion. Right? And so this is a vital function for all living things, whether we're talking about animals or plants, right? So there we go. Primary function of carbohydrates is that energy source for all living things. Another function is that it acts as a structural membrane, structural material for cell membranes. Just to give you some background, and I don't really want to go into much detail this year with this because it becomes a bigger topic next year. But you know, if you were to take it a cross section of any cell, and I've just made this a simple cell, taking away any of the cell contents, what you would see is kind of like a bilayer, a double layer, right? So I've got this molecule with an individual one of these molecules would look something like this. It would look, it's got this little head thing and then these two little tails. But then if I take one and I kind of put it on top of the other, kind of facing each other, then that creates what we call a bilayer. Okay, bi meaning two. So that's a bilayer because there's a top layer and a bottom layer that together form the whole membrane. So if we expand on this, I'm going to get rid of that. If we expand on this, then if I zoom in on that little section, right, you can see the bilayer here. If I zoom in there though, what you'll see is that the cell membrane, this is a cell membrane, but embedded in it, and what is of critical importance, are these little markers on its surface. And many of these markers contain some kind of a carbohydrate component. So glycoprotein. The glyco prefix means sugar. So this is a protein with a sugar little marker on the surface. Over here we see glycolipid. So the glyco part tells me that there's a sugar component there. So carbohydrates are really vital to our, in terms of creating a structure that has signaling mechanisms on our cell membrane. So what are some sources of carbohydrates? So if you want to take in some carbohydrates, where do you go? Well, producers, i.e. Plants, are going to get carbohydrates through photosynthesis, right? They're going to be exposed to the sun. They're going to take in the sun's rays, and they're going to utilize that light energy to produce their own sugars. Right? Consumers like us, we cannot photosynthesize. That'd be convenient, but we can't. And so we need to consume our carbohydrates through various food sources. And some good food sources for carbohydrates are, and these are, most of these are complex carbohydrates. We're going to get into that, like potatoes, corn, rice. Fruit contains some simple sugars that we're going to talk about. So those are all possible sources of carbohydrates, so whether they're long-term or short-term, right? So there we go. Those are just some examples. You probably thought of others. That's good. Okay, so now we are going to get into the nitty-gritty details of carbohydrates. We're going to divide them into 3 groups. We're going to first talk about a sugar group called the monosaccharides. So take a minute and think about, well, what does that prefix mono mean? I'm hoping that you remembered that mono means one. So what could one mean in this context? Well, a monosaccharide is a type of sugar molecule composed of a single unit. Okay, so saccharide, FYI, is a suffix that often refers to some kind of a sugar, right? So monosaccharides, one sugar. So to give you a visual, often we'll see our sugar molecules depicted in a ring format. So this right here, in fact, is a glucose molecule. Right, but often we'll see it in a sort of a straight configuration or in a ring. And so that's a detail in grade 12. We'll talk about the conditions under which we'll see that glucose molecule form a ring or form a straight chain. So one thing that's worth noting is that in our monosaccharides, we will see a ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen of 1 to 2 to 1. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if I were to count up all the carbons, okay, in the case of glucose, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, right? 12 hydrogens. I'll let you do the counting, but I assure you there are 12. And 6 oxygens, right? So in a glucose molecule, the formula is C6H12O6, but you can see that 6 to 12 to 6 is really just a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. And so we're going to see that in our monosaccharides. Okay, so let's get to some examples of monosaccharides. Glucose. We've already talked about glucose extensively. Again, as I mentioned before, it is the primary energy source for cells. Another one is fructose. So fructose, if you look on the side of your corn syrup container, what you might find is that it says high fructose corn syrup. And that just is telling you that it has a high quantity or a high percentage of fructose. But we will find that type of sugar, that monosaccharide, in fruits. And the last one is galactose. Galactose, in there you probably see lactose. And we're going to get to lactose and how lactose is related to galactose, but we find it in milk. So let's get a visual of this. Oh, I forgot the last one I was going to give you, deoxyribose, which we see in DNA. You'll remember that DNA nucleotides have a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogenous base. And so the sugar found in DNA is deoxyribose, which happens to be a monosaccharide. So here are 3 of the monosaccharides that I mentioned, just for you to kind of compare. These structures you don't need to know or recognize this year. You will next year, but this year, you can see that there are some differences, right? So glucose versus fructose, you can identify as being different simply because they're both rings, but one of them forms sort of like a hexagon type shape, whereas fructose forms more of like a pentagon shape. If you look really closely at glucose versus galactose, you'll see some structural changes. Like for instance, over here we have the H on top and the OH on the bottom, whereas in galactose that is reversed. So that's a good indicator that you have galactose amongst other things. Okay, again, those structures not important this year. Simply knowing and being able to say, well, is fructose a monosaccharide? Yes, it is. That's what I want you to know this year. Okay, the second group is disaccharide. So a disaccharide, di standing for, you guessed it, 2. So in this context, we're looking at disaccharides, meaning that each individual sugar molecule is going to be composed of 2 subunits joined together. So like for instance, you could probably guess based on our last picture, that maybe this is glucose and maybe this is fructose. So this is a disaccharide because they are, you can see symbolically, we're showing that they are bonded together to form a whole molecule. Okay, there it is in sort of more detailed form. Again, not responsible for that this year. Okay, so some examples. This is what you do need to know. You need to know the different combinations of monosaccharides that produce given disaccharides. So the first one is maltose. So I get a maltose molecule if I take 2 glucose molecules and bond them together. What does that look like? It looks something like this. So the pictures are just, the diagrams are there, the molecular structures are simply there for you to kind of help you to visualize it. This is what I want you to know. So maltose, have you ever had Maltesers or even malt sugar, for instance? A malted milk, those malt balls with that stuff in the Maltesers, the stuff that's in the middle is a malt sugar. And so you get that by taking 2 glucose molecules and bonding them together, as we can see in this diagram. The next one is lactose. And so lactose, I think we're fairly familiar with. The typical individual, if you ask them, well, what is lactose? You'll probably say that's, you find lactose in milk. Well, lactose is in fact a disaccharide found in milk. It's the sugar that we find in milk that makes it sort of a little bit sweet. But what is it made of? Well, it's made up of a glucose molecule bonded to a galactose. And so, there's our pictorial diagram of that, right? We can see that they're bonded together, right? And so galactose, separate from glucose, they're each individually monosaccharides. But as soon as we bind them together, we form a new molecule, a new molecular structure, which has the name lactose. And in fact, when we talk about people who are lactose intolerant, it's often that their bodies don't have the proper mechanism to take this little bond right here and break it apart. Remember how we said nutrient groups need to be broken down, macromolecules need to be broken down into smaller molecules in order for them to be absorbed into our bloodstream. Well, people who are lactose intolerant won't have the capacity to break that bond and thereby take in the lactose and digest it properly. So instead, their body just sort of holds on to it, leads to bloating and gas and often diarrhea and other digestive problems. Okay, so sucrose. Sucrose is the final disaccharide that we're going to talk about, and it's the one that is the most common, I think, that we use in our daily life. I would bet that chances are you've had some sucrose at some point today. It's in so many commercial products, but what it is sucrose is a disaccharide made up of glucose and fructose. So your regular table sugar, that white stuff that's refined, that will likely be sucrose. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. So the third group, we've talked about monosaccharides, which were single sugar molecules. We've talked about disaccharides, which we get when we take two monosaccharides and join them together. The last is the polysaccharide. So poly is a prefix that means many. So as soon as we take many of our monosaccharides and start to join them together, we get a polysaccharide. And so that's all we're really talking about when we say polysaccharide. And so these polysaccharides will often kind of be a way for us to take these smaller sugar molecules and create a bit of a storage mechanism for them, right? You've talked about carb loading probably at some point if you're an athlete, or you've heard about carb loading. Typically, you're taking in a polysaccharide and you are getting your body to store it so that you have these reserves of sugar molecules that are stored nice and neatly, ready for your body to break them down later and to use for energy. You'll remember that our monosaccharides, particularly glucose, are what we have are what we use for energy source. So you can sort of think of it almost like just a packaging mechanism for energy, right? So, here's a glucose molecule, but when we take a bunch of glucose molecules together, we get a polysaccharide. And in this case, we're talking about starch, right? So carb loading often involves eating starchy foods. For instance, pasta. Pasta is a complex carbohydrate with lots of starch in it. Starch is a particular type of polysaccharide we find in plants. So another example, so here are examples. So we've got starch, which we find in plants, in their roots and their stems. Next year, we'll talk a little bit more about the molecular structure of various types of starches like amylose and amylopectin. Another one is cellulose. So cellulose we find in the cell walls of plants and some other organisms, mainly plants. If you've ever had, and it's what gives those plant cells their nice structure. So those, I'm thinking about celery. If you've ever eaten celery and those stringy pieces on the celery, that is made of tough cellulose. And there's some key structural differences between starch and cellulose. They're both made of glucose molecules, but organized and bonded in a different way, and that gives them separate chemical properties. Okay, the next one is glycogen. So glycogen is kind of like the animal equivalent of starch. It is the way that animals, such as humans, are able to store excess glucose to use for later or in case of stress or in need, right? So you carb load so that you develop glycogen stores, and so those glycogen stores serve as like almost like a pool of glucose molecules that your body can access for extra energy. And the last one is chitin, and I think we've talked about chitin before. When we think about insects that have a hard external or exoskeleton, well, that exoskeleton is chitin, and chitin happens to be a polysaccharide. It's a sugar molecule, which is sort of weird to think about. It's got some other weird things in it, like nitrogen, that some of our other polysaccharides don't have, but really important for creating that nice structure. So chitin is almost like the insect equivalent of cellulose, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, so at this point, what I want you to do is to take a 10-minute break. Because that is it on our section on carbohydrates. Remember that I am available all day up until about 3 o'clock to answer any of your questions via Zoom. So please feel free to access me in that way. I'm happy to help.